Yeah, good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment webinar. This month's series is entitled The Proposed Pebble Mine and Threats to Our Ways of Life, Bristol Bay Community's ongoing efforts to protect our cultures and health. My name is Nick Reardon, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be hosting today's webinar. So we're joined by Alannah Hurley and Dr. Cameron Wobus to share with us their insight and experience with the controversial Pebble Mine prospect, the proposed Pebble Mine, and the permitting process and the impacts and risks this development presents to the Bristol Bay region. For those of us not familiar, CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and Environment. That's the CHE, the C-H-E, and our aim is to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about links between human health and a myriad of environmental factors. More information you can find at our websites, either akaction.org or healthandenvironment.org. As usual, the call will last 1 hour. And in this case, we've reserved most of the second half for discussion and to answer questions from folks. So in this case with Zoom, you can type your questions into the chat box at your convenience, and we'll have that list there and pose them to our guests in the second half of the hour. I'll also try to remember to just allocate a little bit of time for those calling in by phone. And we'll take a minute just to see if anybody wants to chime in. A bit more about our speakers. Alannah Hurley is the Executive Director of the United Tribes of Bristol Bay, a tribal consortium that has been advocating and working to protect the traditional Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq ways of life in Southwest Alaska that depend upon the pristine Bristol Bay Watershed, most notably in the news, at least, is the wild salmon populations. Alannah's work involves giving a singular voice to these groups, desires to protect their lands and waters, salmon fisheries, and associated cultural traditions. Dr. Cameron Wobus is a senior scientist at Colorado-based Linker Tech, and as an earth scientist, his specialty is in geomorphology, hydrogeology, and climate science. Especially pertinent for today's conversation is Cam has extensive experience assessing and reporting on the impacts of hard rock mining, the jurisdictional limits of the Clean Water Act, and natural resource damage assessment. So yeah, welcome again to both of you. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and everybody else for calling in. And yeah, do either of you have any comments before Cam takes it away? Let me make sure here that Cam's unmuted.
There we go. Can people hear me now?
I sure can, Cam. Loud and clear.
I think I might have been forcibly muted. Apologies for that.
No, that's on our end. You're good.
I don't know if you wanted Nick for me to lead off or if you wanted Alannah to lead off, but I'm happy to go either way, whatever I think makes the most sense.
Yeah, I'm happy with you. Yeah, leading the charge, Cam. Alannah, if you
Sure.
have, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Thanks for having me on the I guess maybe show, whatever we call this. This is Zoom meeting, whatever we call life these days. Yeah, as Nick just said, my name's Cam Wobus. I'm a senior scientist at Linker Technologies here in Boulder, Colorado. My background is really geomorphology, hydrology, and climate change, as Nick pointed out. But really, for this effort, what's most important is that I spend a lot of time thinking about surface water and groundwater hydrology and how water flows in over and through landscapes. So I started studying the Pebble mine, the hydrology of the Pebble mine, about a decade ago. I've been working on and off on understanding the hydrology of the Pebble mine for most of those 10 years. And so I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of what's going on at the site. Can people still hear me? Because my screen just changed.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Before I had like a whole bunch of people on it, and now I just have like a blank Zoom screen. Anyway, so I'm sure that those of you who've been following the news have seen a lot of, PLP, Pebble Limited Partnership. I don't know if I want to call it propaganda, but a lot of things in the news suggesting that, the Pebble mine occupies a very, very small fraction of the watershed, and the mine infrastructure is being designed so that it will be a zero discharge facility, and therefore, this mine can coexist with salmon. And that's sort of been the tagline that you see as the EIS has come out. But there really are a number of risks that I think are really downplayed in this, that have been downplayed in this environmental impact process. And I wanted to just kind of talk about a few of those. But before I do that, I kind of want to start off by just taking a little step back from Pebble and contrast the Pebble deposit, which obviously is in southwestern Alaska, with kind of all of the other largest copper mines in the US. And if you look at where all of those mines are, they're all in the desert Southwest. They're in Nevada, they're in Utah, they're in Arizona. And in these places, groundwater is typically hundreds of feet below ground. When these mines are completed, these open pits that are left behind end up being kind of collection points for groundwater and surface water. So even though the water that flows into those open pits becomes very toxic and acidic when it comes in contact with that mine waste, none of it's really going anywhere. It's hundreds of feet below ground. You have basically a pond at the bottom of a really deep pit, and that water just essentially evaporates. Bristol Bay, as many of you probably know, is a very different place. Instead of a water table that's sort of hundreds of feet deep, the groundwater elevations are really right up to the surface, and groundwater and surface water are really one very closely interconnected system. And that's really a big part of the reason why this watershed is so productive for salmon. So in addition to that, instead of 10 to 15 inches of rain per year like you see in the desert Southwest, the Pebble deposit gets 40 to 50 inches of rain per year. And for those of you who've been there, or if you've talked to anyone who has been there, they'll tell you that walking around at the Pebble deposit is like walking around on a giant sponge. There's literally water everywhere. In addition to that, the Pebble deposit really could not be in a worse place in terms of where it's located in the watershed. The ore body sits right at the drainage divide between the Coctuli River and the Upper Tulare Creek, so that any water that originates at the mine site flows downstream into essentially two of the largest rivers in the Bristol Bay Watershed, the Nishigack and the Kvichak. So what does that all mean? What that means is that if Pebble is developed, it will become a huge water and waste management challenge. Water that comes in contact with the waste rock or the sidewalls of the open pit will need to be captured and treated during operations. The tailings that come out of the mill would need to be secured behind these huge earthen tailings dams. And this is a seismically active part of the country, so that's another challenge. And then water that fills the pit once that mine is abandoned will need to be pumped and treated forever. And that's actually in the mine plan, that they will be pumping and treating that water in the pit forever to prevent it from essentially spilling over and contaminating the downstream environment. So even in this mine plan that is in the environmental impact statement, which includes just developing 10 to 15% of the deposit, this mine would create huge amounts of toxic waste that need to be kept segregated forever from everything downstream. And then I'm sure, as Alannah will discuss, add to that the fact that literally half of the wild sockeye salmon in the world come from those rivers. What that means is that the margin for error for this mine is incredibly low. So I've spent a lot of time over the past several months reading the draft and final environmental impact statement and lots of the supporting documents. And, none of what I've read has convinced me that the mine plan is meeting the high bar that it needs to meet to basically minimize those risks. So I just want to highlight two examples of some of those risks posed by this mine that in my mind haven't really been adequately addressed in the mine plan. The first of those is these tailings dams that need to be built to hold back the waste products from mining. And the second of those is the long-term fate of that open pit when the mine is done and when they walk away. So first of all, tailings dams. Tailings dams are basically just huge earthen dams that hold back the slurry of water and ground up rock that gets generated during the milling process. So the Pebble mine plan as currently proposed would have two of these large tailings dams, one of them holding back what's called non-potentially acid generating waste and one that's holding back what's called potentially acid generating waste. But collectively, those two tailings dams would hold back billions of tons of water and ground up rock. And those dams need to be able to hold that waste back forever. The problem with these dams is that they have a tendency to fail. So if you've been following the news over the past several years, there have been multiple large failures of tailings dams that have caused, massive floods of tailings in British Columbia, Brazil, and other places around the world. And at the draft EIS stage, when they submitted their initial draft for this mine plan, a number of people, including the EPA and the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, suggested that, given the risks posed by these tailings dams, they really needed to model what a tailings dam failure scenario would look like. What would it look like if one of these dams failed and released those tailings into the watershed? So it's really it's in EIS speak, it's a reasonably foreseeable risk of mining, and it could have a significant impact on the ecosystem. But when they came out with the final EIS, rather than kind of answering that call from the cooperating agencies, the Pebble partnership just said, the risk of a tailings dam is way too low to warrant consideration because we have this design that will allow the water to drain out of this facility, and therefore the whole tailings facility will become stable over time. The problem with that is that the bulk tailings facility in particular, the design for that facility is completely conceptual at this point. They haven't provided any details exactly on how this is going to work. And the EIS, the environmental impact statement, just relies on an assertion that the conceptual tailings design will allow the tailings to drain over time and that the tailings will then become kind of a stable dry landform. But the problem with that is that, over the course of this process, the engineers from the Army Corps' third-party contractor and the Alaska Dam Safety Program raised a number of serious concerns about whether this conceptual tailings plan will work. And in a nutshell, what they're saying is that because of the way they're proposing to deposit these tailings as, quote, what they call thickened tailings, because of the way they're planning to deposit them, they're actually not likely to drain the way the mine proponents think they will. And if that happens, that means that the tailings facility doesn't become a dry, stable landform. It becomes an earthen dam holding back a big slurry. And that means that it poses a long-term risk. So myself and some colleagues at Linker developed a numerical model of what a tailings dam failure might look like using available data from the EIS. And our modeling indicated that if the bulk tailings dam were to fail, those tailings could make it more than 80 kilometers downstream and possibly all the way to Bristol Bay. And that's completely consistent with observations from other tailings dam failures, in particular the big failure in Brazil a few years ago. Those tailings made it all the way from, the foothills in the Amazon all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, about 350 miles away. So we made that model available between the draft and the final EIS, but it wasn't really discussed in any detail other than, an appendix that talked about why our modeling didn't need to be done because their tailings dam can't possibly fail. So the tailings dams are a really significant risk, in my opinion. The other major concern I have is related to the open pit. One key part of their assumption that this is a zero discharge mine is that the water in the open pit will be pumped and treated forever after the mine closes. And that's in the EIS. They basically say, you know, this facility will need to be pumped and treated forever. Because the water in the pit will become acidic and contain high concentrations of dissolved metals, perpetual treatment also means that there's a perpetual liability sitting right in the headwaters of the Bristol Bay ecosystem once this mine is done. So just remember, this is not Utah or Arizona, where the pit is, you know, a groundwater sink and it's hundreds of feet below ground. If they stop pumping and treating this, the pit will fill and overtop, and that water will spill downstream if it's simply left alone. So if the pumps fail or if the site becomes abandoned at any point in the future for any reason, that toxic water will spill downstream into the Bristol Bay ecosystem. The EIS makes a bunch of questionable assumptions in the water quality modeling, but even with those assumptions, they predict that the copper concentrations in the open pit, once that pit is abandoned, would be anywhere from 100 to 200 times higher than the water quality standards. Under kind of more reasonable assumptions, in a paper we just published last month, we actually calculated that copper concentrations would be more like 50,000 times higher than water quality standards. But in any case, given the range of possible copper concentrations in that pit, if that pit spills over at any point in the future, you need to dilute that water by a factor of anywhere from 100 to 50,000 if you want that water to become safe for aquatic life downstream. And in our calculations in the paper we just published, even with that really optimistic assumption of, you know, the water quality is only 200 times higher than copper standards, the South Fork of the Cocktooley becomes contaminated for at least 35 miles downstream, which means, you know, you're exceeding water quality standards. And in that more reasonable scenario, we calculated what I consider more reasonable copper concentrations. You know, you're still exceeding water quality standards by a factor of about 1,000, 35 miles downstream, if this open pit is allowed to spill over and flow downstream. So this is certainly not a far-fetched scenario. You know, you look at lots of mines around the world, and the mining companies come in, they mine, and they walk away. So if that were to happen, and there's no one to pay the bills for pumping and treating this water long-term, that's what happens. The pit overflows, that contaminated water flows downstream. So these are all based on the assumption that they're going to develop just this small mine that is 10% of the deposit. And I'm sure people have been reading the news lately about, you know, all these folks from the Pebble Limited Partnership being recorded saying that really this is a 100 to 200 year mine. We're going to develop the whole thing. But even if they're just developing this little tiny mine that they're proposing in the EIS, there's a lot of waste management challenges and a lot of real risks to building this mine. So those are sort of just two of the high level concerns that I have. There's a whole bunch more, but I'll leave it at that and let Alannah talk about, you know, why this is so important to so many people.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. That's a great idea. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing that expertise. There was one question that came in, was just that asking if you could post a reference to the paper that you were referring to, and I may have that, but you probably can track it down faster than me. And I can send that out
Sure.
Follow up email too after the call with a link to the recording and all that. But
yeah, I can send around both that paper we just published in August, and also we have a pretty extensive report on our tailings dam modeling that came out a year and a half ago. So I'll send both of those to you, Nick, and you can pass them around.
Thanks, Cam. Alannah, how's are you there? Do you have how's the audio? Maybe I need to unmute you as well.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. I'll just jump right in then. I hope my internet stays stable throughout the rest of the webinar. But first, good morning, and Alannah, for this opportunity to share the voices of our people, the Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq people in Bristol Bay today. I want to say thank you so much to the organizers for inviting us, and a big thank you to Cam for giving such a good overview of, you know, the really disturbing technical realities that this mine poses to our watershed. Before I begin, I'd just like, you know, to share a bit about a background about our organization, our people, and the political landscape that's brought us to today. First, I have had the pleasure of meeting some of you, not all of you. My Yupik name is Alutiiq, and my Irish name is Alannah Hurley. And I've had the privilege of working for UTBB for the last 7 years. UTBB is a tribal consortium that represents 15 tribal governments that span across the entirety of the Bristol Bay region and all of our waterways, from Non-Dalton, the closest community to the project, to Pedro Bay on Lake Iliamna, to Chignik Lake on the southern Alaska Peninsula, all the way spanning out to Togiak on our western borders. And our tribal governments represent over 80% of the total population of the region, are people that still live a traditional way of life, hunting, gathering, and fishing as our ancestors have for millennia. And our mission is really simple. It's to protect the native ways of life that have been sustained by our pristine lands and waters. And part of this mission includes opposing unsustainable and destructive development like Pebble. In reality, you know, we're really fighting for our basic human and sovereign rights as Native peoples. And like our ancestors are fighting for the survival of our cultures for generations to come. Pebble's permitting process and project review has been extremely flawed over the course of the last 2.5 years. But before I get into the specifics, I think it's really important to understand Bristol Bay's position and our experience in that process that's brought us to today. Our opposition to this project has been unwavering. It's been very clear that our people are not willing to risk our way of life for a short-term gold mine. For almost 2 decades now, poll after poll has showed over 80% of our region's residents and over 60% of Alaskans oppose Pebble and want Bristol Bay protected. You know, throughout this time, we've packed public hearing rooms to testify, flooded comment periods, sent thousands of letters, all in advocacy for the protection of our region from this mine in local, state, and federal arenas. We continue to fight tirelessly because we know that Pebble would have irreversible and devastating impacts on our watershed and therefore our people. And to date, we've been so grateful. We've been joined by millions of Americans, fishermen, environmentalists, jewelers, sportsmen, consumers, and other tribes in our fight to protect the national treasure that's our home. We've applauded 6 major investors pulling out of the project. And today we're witnessing Pebble currently trying to fundraise for this mine that has no economic feasibility study, social license, or access rights to develop their toxic project. But due to a politically motivated permitting process and hostile state and federal administration, we find ourselves on the precipice of a major 404 permit for this project, which, if it remains on schedule, will be the fastest processed 404 permit for a project of this scale in the history of this country. Our tribes have engaged in this process from the very start. Some served as cooperating agencies. Some engaged the Corps in government-to-government consultation. Our region turned out to the few public hearings that they had in relation to the mine in the region. But from the start, we've really questioned some of the decisions made by the Corps. The extremely accelerated timeline, the lack of tribal consultation and meaningful tribal consultation, the limited public hearing comment periods and hearing locations, it really led us to believe that there was something going on behind the scenes. And now we have the truth. I'm sure many of you have seen the news in the last week and a half about the Pebble tapes that were released last Monday that confirm that from start to finish, this process was owned and operated by the Pebble Limited Partnership. The videos that were recorded by the Environmental Investigative Agency in undercover investigations posing as potential investors detail an unprecedented level of support that Pebble and its parent company, Northern Dynasty, has been receiving from the state and federal government, the Alaska congressional delegation's seeming willingness to quietly allow the process to proceed without stopping the project. Basically, the deceptions to the public and potential investors as it seeks to build, almost a 200-year mine at the headwaters of our life-sustaining salmon fishery, while simultaneously putting in permit applications for a small 20-year mine that we all knew was not realistic from the get-go. In these videos, the CEO of Northern Dynasty, the parent company for Pebble Limited Partnership, Ron Thiessen, and then Pebble's former CEO, Tom Collier, outline the company's very detailed efforts to curry favor with these different regulatory officials to rush the permitting process and avoid the usual standards for permit decisions. As I had said earlier, there's so many discrepancies that we have been hearing for a while about the size of the project, but very surprisingly to many people, they went as far to even talk about connection to the potential Donlin project in the YK, just north of Bristol Bay, really outlining some pretty grand plans to transform all of Southwest Alaska and connect these two projects into a toxic mining district. I don't want to focus on the videos too much, but it really details regular meetings between the Army Corps top staff with Pebble employees, explains how they've used our governor to lobby the White House on their behalf, noting that the Army Corps chose to apply a streamlined permitting process to this project with no authority to do so, to support the company in its efforts to get permitted within the Trump administration, what we hope to be the first Trump administration. And most recently, the Corps on August 24th had sent a letter to the Pebble Limited Partnership outlining the need for further mitigation plans, particularly in-kind mitigation plans within the Alutiiq watershed. And these videos show that their mitigation plan will not only not meet a rigorous threshold, but they've been working hand in hand with the state of Alaska and the Corps on plans to approve that mitigation plan to allow the project to proceed and get a permit decision or record of decision in the near term, which is extremely concerning, as many people in the media had interpreted that delay, including our U.S. senators, was a step in the right direction towards a permit denial. But these tapes really indicate that is nowhere near reality. Excuse me. I'll pause there to make sure I'm still on, just in case I lost the feed.
We can hear you loud and clear, Alannah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I'll wrap up here. I'll just say that the statements in these videos really confirm what people like Cam have talked about and technical experts have been saying for years, that Pebble's plan is incomplete, not yet ready for construction. The current environmental review is based on a fictional mine plan and not in environmental realities. But please don't take my word for it. Go and watch these videos yourself. They paint, a very clear and undeniable picture of things that we've, believed but never had proof of. And that's that Pebble's permitting process has been poisoned by the influence of this mining company that's terrorized our region for over 20 years. So you can imagine that these truths were not surprising to us. What is most frustrating is that it made it really clear that there are countless examples of Pebble having access to information, guidance, and counsel from these federal and state regulators that have never been made available to cooperating agencies like some of our Bristol Bay tribes. And it's been clear that while our tribes have been left to navigate this process and the progression of the project through this process by the crumbs of information the Corps has given them, or by what we read in the news, Pebble has had unprecedented level of access and level of consultation, pre-screening, and assistance that almost borders on conspiracy. With that, it's very clear that what has brought us today is a process that has been the product of deceit and underhanded tactics. It's extremely shameful. We were on a webinar last week with the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA, who continually try to minimize the impact that the release of this tape, or the things that have been exposed by the release of the Pebble tapes, are denying any type of collusion or wrongdoing. But in reality, it's very clear that this was not an objective process, has favored Pebble throughout the entirety. And it must be scrapped, and full investigations must be launched to uncover the full extent of Pebble's influence over this permitting process. So with that, I'll close by saying, from our perspective as the Indigenous people of this region, we know that our home is not meant to be a mining district. Our people have been and will continue to be salmon people. And we take our responsibility that, that we've inherited from our ancestors to be very strong stewards of this amazing place that we're so blessed to call home. And we will not waver in protecting it for future generations. I want to just close by saying and leave you with, while all of this is helpful in our efforts to slow this permitting process down or halt the permitting process, the fight is so far from over. And we really, really need action by our elected leadership. We need our people to be able to hold them accountable for their inaction. But we plan on using every single tool available, from Congress to the courts, to protect our way of life. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Alannah, for sharing your perspective and this valuable information, especially at this period of time where this long-standing battle is not over yet. We'll take this moment to remind the audience that you can type questions into the chat box, and I'll read them and pose them to our guests. One question that came up for you, Alannah, was I was wondering how can people support your efforts and these efforts to oppose the Pebble mine?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways that people can support the efforts. Everything you can do to push your senators, especially if you're in Alaska, Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, to actually walk their talk and move from meaningless statements to, I shouldn't say meaningless, from statements and words to actual action. There's opportunities for them to halt the permitting process through the appropriations process in Congress right now. The EPA not only has the authority, but the responsibility at this point to veto the project. Anything we can be doing to push our elected leadership to hold these governmental agencies accountable for the corruption of this process is critical. Beyond pushing our elected leadership to do their job for Alaskans and Americans, everything we can do to be spreading awareness about this issue, talking to your friends and family, attending things like this, staying up to date, donating to organizations who are doing, this critical work to protect Bristol Bay is all extremely helpful. And we're always so grateful for, all of our allies across the country who have stood with us for so long.
Yeah, thanks, Alannah. I have those references that Cam sent along here that I can add to the chat. Let's see here. There we go. For those wanting to have a look at those papers. And let's see. Yeah, a question for Cam too, as well, is how has academic science concerning the work you've done about the impacts of the proposed mine been informed by local and traditional knowledge or practices? Oh, Cam, you're muted. Let's see.
Oh,
there we
okay.
go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I would say, in a nutshell, not enough. We've been approaching this problem from purely kind of a hydrologic and geochemical and natural science perspective. And there's clearly lots and lots to learn from, the people who live in the watershed that we have simply just not had the bandwidth to incorporate. I think, Alannah can probably speak better than anyone about, things that you just don't get from a high level scientific study, like, where do the salmon collect? What types of environments do they really favor? And there's obviously lots of fish biology that can help you do that. But, the folks who live in the watershed and fish in these waters would know those sorts of things. And I think just that underscores kind of a broader issue from my perspective, is that I don't think, traditional knowledge is incorporated nearly enough in these sorts of things, whether it's for understanding where the ecological resources are, or whether it's for understanding how climate change is influencing the watershed. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for that level of engagement that, unfortunately, we just haven't had the time or wherewithal to do.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. Yeah, it's a big region with lots of aspects. Just seeing, in tying back to the first question for Alannah in terms of what people can do. Yeah, Alannah passed on that. As with so many public issues, to send a letter to Congress, to your representatives. And there's resources and contacts on United Tribes of Bristol Bay's website, which is www.utbb.org. And I'll share that with the group as well. I think that, and we have a comment from another listener that is along similar lines here to encourage your friends and families to vote. This is the most basic step of civic action. They say things won't change until the administration changes. And we have similar challenges here in Idaho, the Midas Gold Stibnite Mine project and the Black Rock Land Exchange, EIS. Similar situations across the United States and no doubt the world. The leadership of federal agencies has an impact. As the election approaches, I have no doubt that will have an impact as well. Let's see. Another question here is for you, Cam. You mentioned the abundance of copper concentrations. Given that this is largely a copper mine, what are the effects of copper on the ecosystem, or is that a particularly dangerous substance to have? You mentioned 50,000 times or something the acceptable quantities, so it certainly sounds beyond safe limits. But what does it do, or what are the potential harms?
Sure. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Excellent. So I am. First of all, I'm not a fish biologist, but I've spent a lot of time hanging out with fish biologists. And my understanding is, so the water quality standards are developed in a number of different ways. Some of them are, how much copper does it take to kill a fish? There's so-called acute water quality criteria. There are chronic water criteria, like if a fish is going to hang out in copper infested waters for 3, 4, 5, 6 days, what are the potential impacts? And one of the most important ones that I've learned is that copper interferes with a fish's ability to smell. It interferes with their olfactory senses. And there's actually been some really cool laboratory experiments where people will expose fish to copper for a little while. And then they will put a a trigger into the water that is, basically ground up fish, which is supposed to be an alarm bell for a fish that there's a predator nearby. And it's really actually neat. You see these videos of fish swimming around, and in the tank where the fish have been exposed to copper, the fish just keep swimming around when they drop in that olfactory signal. And in the tank where the fish have not been exposed to copper, they stop dead in their tracks. And these are at really low concentrations of copper. So why is that important? It's important because salmon use their olfactory senses to essentially smell their way back to where they need to spawn. And so even low concentrations of copper, if it creates kind of avoidance behavior in those fish, they might not be able to find their way back to where they need to spawn. They might just stop dead in their tracks when they hit that, copper pulse and not really know where to go. So that's why I brought up at the very beginning that there's different criteria that are, acute toxicity, what's going to kill a fish, but then there are much, much lower concentrations that will interfere with their ability to find their way home. So that is a hydrologist speaking about ecological and biological systems, but that's my understanding.
Oh, thanks, Cam. I appreciate that. I understand that link now, and that does seem essential. For a functioning salmon habitat.
And I'll point out, the last thing I'll add is, I used copper as an example. There are any number of other contaminants that are toxic to fish. There's cadmium, there's chromium, there's zinc, there's selenium, which is something that wasn't really looked at much in the EIS, but which is actually a substantially toxic metal for fish. So there's lots of other examples of toxic metals in this water once this mine starts getting developed.
Yeah, I gotcha. These minerals don't typically appear as an isolated incident. And crushing them up to increase the surface area, I'm sure will increase their abundance in this wet landscape. Thanks, Cam. There's a message here for Alannah that reads, about 5 years ago, Non-Dalton participated in a project piloting indigenous health indicators of non-physiological health impacts from development projects and climate change. See, they were part of the project. They cannot share the data unless Non-Dalton allows it, but I'm happy to help out if this might be of use. Showing additional impacts to often intangible aspects of health provides more data for the tribal community's defense. This has precedent in the US, the lower 48 with EPA, and also in Canada in stopping the Enbridge pipeline. Yeah, Alannah, have these examples like this been useful? Have you found that to be effective to have more data about the impacts of and studies around health impacts that the mine might have based on other examples? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. Non-Dalton was one of the cooperating agencies that was able to engage in the process from behind the so-called Iron Curtain. And I know that they definitely included all of the information that they've been compiling for years into the public record. And while, usually such compelling evidence would influence the process in the ways that it is meant to or supposed to, unfortunately, our experience in this process was, and Cam might be able to, speak to this as well, regardless of the evidence being presented, it's not impacting the speed at which and the review that the Corps is having, especially when it comes to impacts to local people. From scoping to the draft EIS to the preliminary final EIS, and then eventually to the final, we have watched them not only try to silence local people and the evidence we've brought to the table about how this is going to impact our people, but outright ignore those types of concerns. You know, the question earlier for Cam about traditional ecological knowledge being incorporated into these processes. When these processes are operating under much more reasonable administrations, there's extreme struggles to get Indigenous people's voices actually heard in a real way in these processes. In this specific process, it has been outlandish, the level of pushback on any type of recognition of cultural resources or impacts to Indigenous ways of life, specifically in the National Historic Preservation Act process, where the core, it's actually their legal obligation to be assessing, you know, the impacts of this project on cultural and resources and historic properties. We've had our people, our tribal leaders and our elders actually yelled at by core members in tribal consultation about where sacred sites are, which is astounding to anybody who has familiarity with how these processes are meant to run and have been run in the past. So while all of that information is extremely helpful and helps build the record in the long run, unfortunately, with the current administration, we have had very little to no luck ensuring that those types of things are being considered in a meaningful way in the process.
Thanks, Alannah. Yeah, there's clearly some disconnect between the way the permitting process is currently set up. It doesn't who it's designed for. Let's see here. I've got that link from you, Alannah. This is I'll just send it out in the chat. You mentioned this is a letter that people can sign. Is it what is the letter for?
It was just going back to that first question. A letter, a recent take action letter people can sign asking Congress to halt the permitting process from moving forward, and encouraging the EPA to exercise their veto authority.
Yeah, I gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's see here. Well, if there's anybody calling in, I'm remembering this is there's a handful of folks that are joining us by telephone. If anyone by phone wants to chime in, I can unmute your lines and see if there's just anyone who wants to ask questions directly. Let's see here. Yeah, Alannah, we've got another question from a listener, wondering basically, do you feel like your actions and your efforts have helped this consistent, unwavering opposition? What would have happened without it? Where would we be?
Yeah, and I think that's really a testament. It's a really good question. It's a testament to not only the people of Bristol Bay's opposition, but Alaskans and people across the nation who have been taking action for almost 20 years now. That we would be nowhere near where we are in holding off this project for that period of time if it wasn't for that unwavering opposition across the board from the people of Bristol Bay and all of our allies. And for our people, we don't really have a choice. People talk about issue fatigue in a campaign sense and in other NGOs that we work with. And it's something that isn't even an option to the Indigenous people. Like we don't have the luxury of getting fatigued. We have to keep fighting because what we're fighting for is, the continued existence of our people. But, without our allies and the coalition that has, circled the wagons around Bristol Bay, we would not be anywhere where we are. Today we'd probably have a giant hole in the ground and be talking about Superfund sites and how to attempt to mitigate things that are not mitigatable. So every ounce of energy and letter signed and phone call made to your representatives has made a difference and will continue to.
Yeah, here. I'm realizing I got a couple people mentioned that that the link to the second paper didn't work, and that's my fault. I cut off one of the last digits, so I'm just resending that out. I've tested it, and it'll work now. I have another question for you, Alannah. That's they say, I believe I heard from Alaska tribes that some Alaska tribes are in favor of the mine. Is this true? And if so, do you know what their mindset is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are some communities that have benefited financially initially from the project. They are, a lot of them like to say that they're neutral on the project, but they are the definite minority in this issue. Unfortunately, a lot of the Alaska Native corporations, village corporations, or smaller regional corporations like to mislead the public that they're actually tribal as well, and that's not the case in any way, shape, or form. And the unfortunate reality is these are mining company tactics 101. Come in, try and purchase support from those near the project, divide and conquer tactics that mining companies use throughout the world. In our case, we're very lucky that, it is a very small minority, a couple communities that have kind of bought into this idea that Pebble is the answer to all of our problems. And I'm not going to speak ill of those communities, because our communities, just like rural communities across America, especially Native America, have some real struggles when it comes to sustainable economic development and job creation in our communities. These are struggles that are happening across the country. Where we differ, though, is that we are not willing to trade. The vast majority of Bristol Bay is not willing to trade who we are as Native people and our traditional way of life for a short-term mining project. That's something that, we have been steadfast in communicating. The Pebble is not the answer to our economic woes. And the fact that, colonization is pretty fresh in Alaska, we believe that we have the opportunity to really create a model of sustainability and successful sustainable economic development in our region in ways that are conducive to our traditional way of life and our traditional values and beliefs. And we are, working to get there. It's not a solution that happens overnight. So I'm happy to expand on any of that, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I really appreciate your putting that in sort of a historical context, or even just a time frame of a short-term mine. It's when you compare, when you compare things with the length of the future, be it the future of a culture and a people and a place and an ecosystem, or the future of monitoring a tailings pond in perpetuity. The mining looks very short. So.
Yeah, and even with our existing commercial fishery, over 130 years of a sustainably managed commercial fishery that contributes billions of dollars to the American economy annually, based on a sustainable resource, over 14,000 jobs annually. A lot of those jobs, are for people in region. And is it perfect? No. Do our people benefit from those potential, or these longstanding industries in the maximum capacity we can? Not currently, but that doesn't mean that those things can't change. So, even from an economic perspective, this mine doesn't pencil out in terms of long-term development, economic development in Bristol Bay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see, there's a few other questions that have come in here. And if we don't get to some of these questions, I know we're getting close to the hour, I can pass them on to you guys, and I can maybe if you have any responses, I can include them in a follow-up email. But somebody's wondering here if there were, let's see, they're wondering if there's a unified strategy to take on a specific permit process. So I'm kind of, maybe that's wondering if are there examples that you were drawing on, or is there kind of a playbook of sorts to oppose the permitting process or kind of engage with it, or how much of this was new water or new territory?
Can you hear me? This is Cam.
Yeah.
I can chime in briefly from my perspective. I'm sure Alannah has maybe a different perspective, but for me as a scientist, what's been remarkable about this kind of consortium of people who have come to look at this mine is that everything we've raised is science-based. It's pointing at deficiencies in the science and the EIS. I'm not driven by politics. I like to look at the facts and see where there are holes in the facts. And I, as a hydrologist, have done that on this mine. I know that people who are geochemists and aquatic ecologists and engineers and other types of expertise have looked at it through the lens of their expertise. And I think that's been really effective because there's just so many deficiencies in the way they've approached this problem that, we've compiled a whole bunch of reports and a whole bunch of commentary on the EIS that I think has been, I don't know if there's a playbook, but if there was a playbook, in my perspective, it would be, comment on the substance. And if you can comment on the substance, then it's a lot harder to refute it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. We've been so lucky to have people like Cam and other technical experts work so diligently to ensure that the scientific realities are being documented throughout this process. And from the tribe's perspective, we had technical experts work with us as well, not only with our organization and our tribes, but with our cooperating agencies that were invaluable. And so ensuring that we're, accomplishing what Cam is talking about, and at the same time, exerting our sovereignty within those processes, navigating it from a cooperating agency perspective as well as from a public perspective. So our tribal members are informed and engaged, and engaging in the public side of things has been really key for us as well. So I'll just, summarize by saying there has been a lot of thought about how we effectively engage in this process from a public perspective and from a way that really amplifies and utilizes our relationship with the U.S. government on a government-to-government perspective.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing and joining us today and talking with us about this pretty timely issue. We have run out of time for the morning. And I know there's a couple, there's a couple more questions in the chat, but I'll pass those on to you, Cam and Alannah. But I really want to thank our speakers and everyone who joined us. I'll send out an email within the next day or two. That's good. I'll send out an email within the next day or two with a link to the recording of the call and a list of related resources and maybe a couple more answers to these questions. Feel free to send additional questions to me at nick.r@akaction.org. The next call will be the last Wednesday in October, the 28th, and we'll be joined by Claire Barnett for the Healthy Schools Network to talk about best practices. for families and students and teachers and the districts themselves during this pandemic. And finally, I hope you'll consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics to support these monthly Che-Alaska calls. Without your contributions, we need that for the support to continue bringing you these calls each and every month. If you have any additional questions or comments, feel free to contact us. Our phone number here in Anchorage is 907-222-7714. Thanks again to everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.